You're listening to the Vint Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast, a production of the Vint Marketplace, your source for premium wine and spirits at vintmarketplace.com. As always, I'm joined by Billy Galanko, whether it's 2023, 24, 25, he's in studio with me. How you doing, Billy?
I'm doing very well. Happy New Year to you and all the listeners.
Happy New Year to you too. I know you did a lot more celebrating over the holidays, some time abroad, getting ready to come back my direction though next week as well. So lots of travel on your agenda.
Yeah. We had a very eventful couple weeks. I think we mentioned before I'll be traveling, but I was in Taiwan and Thailand, and then we rang in the new year in Bangkok, which was a pretty exciting place to do that for sure. Didn't drink a lot of wine. Taiwan has more places with wine, but we had very little time, and somehow the sushi, like we had sushi one night, which was also interesting. My wife loves Taiwanese food, and we had Japanese food one night. So I was like, we'll be back. But the main two wine, I had a wine story and I just had like one that was an interesting story. So the two wine experiences we really had that were memorable were in Bangkok. One was on the rooftop where they filmed Hangover 2. There's a couple scenes while they're on top of a building in Bangkok. And they have various restaurants and it's a really cool view. It's on the 67th floor. But we went to this wine bar and they just basically essentially overcharged by a lot for wine. Adam, our COO, was mentioning that it's probably just due to taxes, but I got a glass of Christian Moreau, just like baseline Chablis. I think it was 2018 for, I don't know, the equivalent of $50 or $60 US, which is more than a bottle would retail here. And then my wife, I think she had just like a baseline Bollinger.
Wait, the glass of Chablis was $50?
Yeah, 50 or 60.
Nice.
And then she had a non-vintage Bollinger for $70 a glass.
Wow.
It was mainly paying for the view, but that was interesting. And then I basically scoured the city. And aside from a few places that were targeted towards expats, there really wasn't much wine. Every place, if they had wine, had like some Australian wine, some Chilean wine, maybe a couple Italian. And then they would have a Thai wine that was maybe imported from Australia and then included Thai orchard fruits. They would just say orchard fruits. It would say Chardonnay on the front. You'd turn around the back and it would say, this also has fresh orchard fruits. And that was not like tasting notes, like actually included, like the juice. So that was interesting. But one of the places we went that had a legit wine list, decently legit, had our friend Laurent Ponceau. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Nice.
That he's gotten all over the world. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm sure he went there himself. So I'm looking forward to showing him. I'm going to send him a note this week and see if he says. But my main story that I wanted to share that I thought was actually interesting. We went from Bangkok and then we went down to Krabi, which is by Phuket in the south, to be more in like the beaches and islands. But the wild part was when I was in Bangkok, I was like, a lot of these buildings, there's some really modern buildings next to not as modern buildings. And I was like, I wonder how many of these have just been like lightly renovated and are like, how safe are they? Just out of curiosity. It's like carbon monoxide. So the day before we're about to fly back, and Bangkok's an amazing city, and there's tons of like very, very safe everything. So it was just weird that I was thinking this, and then the day before we go back, I was checking into our Expedia because I was like, I was going to ask them about doing New Year's on the rooftop of our hotel, and I wanted to see the reply to their message. They had actually sent us a message that was like, "Hi, we're reaching out to say there was a fire emergency in the hotel last night. We're working through it. The authorities are here investigating, and they would prefer that we don't have any new guests arrive for the foreseeable future." And I was like, all right, well, that sucks. Cause it was like, we're literally going the next day. So I was like,
man,
maybe we have to figure out a new place. Apparently there was an emergency and they're not letting people in right now. So we ended up booking a much better place and a beautiful rooftop. So that actually worked out really well. But in the meantime, while I was still looking for that, I was like, I want to see if this fire made the news. So I Google it, and I type in the hotel name, and it turns out the fire had killed 3 tourists and 7 more were in the hospital in like critical condition.
What the heck?
So when they were saying the authorities weren't letting people in, it's because there was actually like an investigation into people dying in their rooms.
Oh my goodness.
And we weren't like slumming it. And this was on a very famous like backpacking street in Bangkok. And it was a pretty nice hotel. It was only like $100 a night, but by Bangkok standards, money goes further. And I was just like, man, what are you booking us in?
Well,
like,
I was thinking that meant like they had a fire in the kitchen or like a microwave like shorted out, not like rooms were engulfed in flames. That's terrible. That's really terrible.
Yeah. They're yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I thought. And I was like, all right. And then they were like, nope, these 2 floors, multiple people died. I think they identified the rooms. So it might not have been like a wiring problem. It might have been like somebody doing something, but like people had to be rescued from the roof. And I was like, wow, that was 2 days before we were supposed to be there. Thank God that didn't happen while we were there. So that was a close call. But yeah, otherwise it was a great trip.
Billy always traveling and dodging bullets. What can you say?
Yeah. There was a couple bullets. A plane from Bangkok was one that crashed in Korea while we were there too. And everybody on that plane, except for a couple, died. So I was like, well, we got to fly out of Bangkok too. But that was also not the Bangkok Airlines problem. So
you should probably just stay in LA, maybe.
Nah, all's well that ends well. And actually, the place we ended up getting instead of that hotel was way better. I thought it was great. I feel bad people had to die for us to get a better spot, but it worked out.
It feels like that's something that'll probably get you canceled.
Oh yeah, I probably shouldn't say that. But
guy gets huge hotel upgrade
and $50 Expedia credit. So in that call, just one last note on that. I kept trying to get a refund for that hotel, and I was like, I had messaged them on Expedia, and then they were like, all right, hold on, we need to contact the hotel. And I was like, I don't think you understand. Like the hotel's closed because of the huge fire. And they were like, well, we're still trying to reach them. They spent 40 minutes trying to reach them. I was like, you have to understand, like the whole thing's closed by police, and like I don't think they're reachable. But it all's well that ends well. So thanks for bearing with my little New Year's story, but that was the exciting part.
Yeah. On the other hand, we were laying in bed, and I was like, oh, listen to that. I was like, what is that? I was like, fireworks. I was like, oh, it must be midnight. And then we fell asleep. So that was what happened at our house.
Nice. We toasted with some random Prosecco that they had. It was better than a off-dry fruit wine that they were serving elsewhere. So could have been worse.
Yeah, what kind was it, like native fruits and stuff? Or I don't know. I guess they have peaches there, probably good climate, like that kind of thing.
They have all sorts of fruits. It could have been anything. The bottles literally just said ripe orchard fruits. And who knows what they were. It could have been anything. We didn't end up trying those wines. We actually got a few free bottles. They would put them in our hotel room and be like, these are for you. And then we just never opened them because we're like, I think somebody else could enjoy these more than us. But yeah. And then the other highlight from the weekend, I had my first Chateau Moussard. I'm not quite sure why I waited so long.
I didn't know that, actually. I thought. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which one did you have? White, red, rosé? Red.
My first like real legit one. It was 2014. Their Grand Van. I was at a shop. There's a whole area of LA, Eastern LA, called the San Gabriel Valley. And we go out there to buy Asian food and Asian groceries. And there's an Asian store there that sells everything from ginseng to tea, like rice cookers. And they also have a randomly good wine selection. So I went there for another purpose, and they had the 2014 Chateau Moussard on sale for $54.
That's
and
great.
I was like, holy moly. Yeah. I've been looking for it for 70 or below. If I could get it, I would. And I was like, no, maybe we got to get it. And it was everything I was hoping for. It was just like Vince said in our episode. It was like very light bodied, but yet so concentrated and packed with flavor and very, very nuanced and spicy. You may even loved it. So we corvined about a third of the bottle, and I really want to experience it fully. So I'm going to open the rest this weekend and decant it fully and really see what it's got. But it was amazing.
Yeah. My memory of that wine was that it just keeps changing, so much more you had opened. I think it was I'm trying to think of the last time I had the red. I think I might have had it was either might have been the 2014. They hold back, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it was the 2014 as well. It might have been last year, Super Bowl. The 2014 and some Bordeaux, like Pomerol maybe, but we had them together. And I remember everyone liked the Pomerol, and then like throughout the night, like when the Moussard opened up, like people were like, oh, this is actually really interesting. And so this is a group of people who would probably gravitate towards the Pomerol anyways, just based on style and interest. But yeah, just one of those wines that was like, okay. But then 3 hours later, people are like, oh, this is cool. So yeah, it's definitely that type. I was really pumped when I got all three. Like I got the they're red, they're white, and they're rosé, which are just like really cool bottles to have together in my little Eurocav rack. Yeah, it's a neat brand, and it's a fun label to have in your collection if you're a collector.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to trying the white. We drank it while watching Vince's Lebanon episode, the part of the episode where he went to Chateau Moussard. So we tried to pretend we were there. I recommend everybody watch that episode if they haven't as well. It's a great episode. But
the rosé is one of the prettiest colored wine. I know that like in some of the like provincial rosés, you can get like such a spectrum of color. These Moussard rosés just have such a pretty hue to them. They're really cool.
Yeah. Well, speaking of unique wines that maybe not everybody would gravitate towards, maybe the region, but the wine itself they would. Our guest today is Mark Blatty from Byron Blatty Wines here in Los Angeles County. He makes wines from the area. You guys might remember we had Abe Schoner on, who also made wines from the area. But when Abe was going more towards more lower intervention wine style, Byron Blatty makes a really highly polished, really high quality wines that are very similar to Napa Cabs, for example. They make Cabernet as their primary variety that they work with. And they're really, really high quality wines. I wanted to have him on for a while. When I first moved here, I went to a tasting not too far away of local LA winemakers because I had just come from Australia where I was making wine and I wanted to engage with people who I could maybe make wine with. I ended up connecting with Patrick Kelly over at Cavaletti Vineyards and working with him to make my own wine and helping him pick grapes. But Byron Blatty was also picking grapes from the same vineyard up in North LA County at that time. So that was cool. I got to meet Mark. And he was really nice, really cool. And his brand, whereas Patrick's he makes really high quality traditional wines, but it's had a less steep trajectory, I guess you want to say. It's more like those in the know in the area have been getting it, and they're really great wines. Byron Blatty skyrocketed right to the top. I think part of it is because Mark and his wife have connections in the film industry, so they're able to get the wine in the hands of some people who could share it with a lot of people who know what they're up to. And they also got into some really high-end restaurants here in LA, which was really cool to see. And they make top tier quality Cabernet, some of it sourced from like Malibu. And it was really cool to talk with him about how the brand's grown and the wine itself.
Yeah, being West Coast ignorant, I had to look up just like LA County boundaries. And because in my mind, I'm like, oh, LA, that I'm sure they found some plots just outside the city or something like that. But LA County is huge, right? It's probably the part that's not Los Angeles proper is probably 2/3 of the county itself. So there's tons of land in LA County that isn't LA. And you get up north of, like you said, north of Pasadena, and there's all kinds of state parks and reserves and protected land. And it's like the country. I encourage you to go on and check that out if you're not familiar with the landscape, to get a sense of where Mark is talking about sourcing fruit from in this episode. I definitely expanded my understanding of the geography of that area and the potential even to there. I think it's really cool to have that kind of diversity in landscape, and seems like a lot of opportunity. Under the Byron Blatty label, they have all kinds of different varieties that maybe you wouldn't expect to see in a single portfolio from a place like Los Angeles, quote unquote. So really cool, giving people a sense of the breadth of wines that you can be able to make super high quality in that area. I think that was surprising for me, and I think it will be for listeners too.
Yeah. So I encourage everybody to seek these out if you can find them. I don't exactly know all the states that they ship to, but anybody who likes a good oak-aged Napa Cab or even a Paso Cab, these wines are definitely right up your alley. They're really well made. So encourage everybody to seek them out if they can.
Awesome. Yeah. And again, before we get to our interview, check out our wine and spirits retail store at vintmarketplace.com, where you can find fine wines from all around the world. We have one of the largest selections of wines here in the U.S. and some of the most competitive pricing for consumers and collectors. So the Vint Marketplace is your go-to shop for stocking your wine cellar, whether it's Chateau Moussard, like we talked about, or your favorite Bordeaux. So without further ado, here's our interview with Mark Blatty of Byron Blatty Wines.
Hi, Mark. Thanks so much for joining today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been a long time. I've been actually looking forward to having you on the podcast. I don't know if you remember, probably not. When I first moved here 6 years ago, I went to a tasting at Mission Wines, and you were there with Patrick Kelly. And it was my first touch point into LA winemaking. I always remember that because I went on to pick grapes at Swayze Vineyard with Patrick, where you could also source fruit from at the time. So,
well, yeah. That's funny because that was probably one of the earliest like LA tastings.
Yeah, very much. And it was cool. Yeah, because we were just talking offline about this tasting that we did last week. And it was really interesting because I remember your project, which I would love for you to talk a little bit about your background and how you started it. But your winery it felt very nascent then. And then going to this tasting last week, it feels very well established. You just opened a tasting room. So would love to hear your history and the history of the wine.
Sure. Well, believe it or not, we have been making wine now. This past vintage it would be our 11th vintage, which when you say that out loud, it sounds like a really long time, right? 11 vintages. Really what it means though in winemaking is you've tried this 10 times. So in terms of wineries, we still feel like we're very early on in our journey, but wine's not a fast thing, right? It's a slow burn. We started in 14. That was our first vintage. We did 2 barrels. In 15, we got up to maybe 5 barrels. And then 17, we overdid it and went a little crazy, but we tried tons of things from all over LA and ramped way up. And then we've over time settled in at the moment to, it varies, but somewhere between 300 and 750 cases annually. But that is also spread out across usually anywhere from 8 to 15 different wines. Our biggest production ever on a single wine has been about 175 cases, and our smallest ever has been 11 cases. And we average somewhere between 25 and 50 cases a SKU.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think we're always looking for folks who are taking care and making wine and not just small quantities, but minuscule quantities as you guys are, which is always fascinating. Maybe you can give us just a little bit of an overview on LA County, and then we'll dive more into your background.
Sure. Well, our focus, of course, is fruit within LA County. We do work with a little fruit outside of LA on occasion, but that's usually if it's something we can't get here. The great thing about LA, the boundaries of LA, it's a massive area. So there's actually quite a diverse range of climates, terroir, if you will. There's coastal regions, canyons, mountains, high desert. The only thing that prevents LA from being a powerhouse wine region is just that the land is all gone. And that's something we could talk about the history of it. But just to describe the wide range of terroir, right? Like I said, LA, we get fruit from the Malibu coast that has hot areas, cooler areas. We get a little bit of fruit sometimes out of Bel Air, which is like on the cooler side, but still the thing that we always get in LA, no matter where you are, is plenty of sun, plenty of heat, but there's diverse soil types. We get out in the high desert. There's like a hard pan, a lot of clay and sand and really, really hot. The high elevation makes it so you can still do fun things. So it's really, there's something for everyone in LA when it comes to growing grapes as a region.
So I think when most people think of LA, they might think of Bel Air, which I didn't. I think it's fun that there's an area that grows grapes called Bel Air, just because of Fresh Prince. But can you talk a little bit about your background? You were in the stereotypical, no offense there, but you're in the industry before you got into wine. Can you talk a little bit about that and then what inspired you to start making wine? And then we'll dive into the specific wines.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I spent the majority of my career doing unscripted television and still do, although I do a little bit more feature documentary now. But my wife and I, it was probably mid 2000. Wine was always around my family, but it wasn't super prominent. We don't come from like a wine family by any stretch, but just part of culture growing up. But my wife, Jenny, and I started going up to Napa Valley in probably mid 2000s and sort of became smitten with Napa Valley Cab as an entry point into serious wine. And it was actually in Napa Valley tasting about 1,000 Cabernets a day where we started to understand the notion of terroir and that growing grapes in different regions could produce a wildly different style. And that was actually Howell Mountain Cab, that everywhere we'd go in Napa, like you said, it all starts to run together after a while when you're drinking that many in a day. We have some really spectacular wines, but they're very similar to each other. And then every fifth or sixth wine, something would stand out. And it was like, oh, what's this? And oh, that's our Howell Mountain Cab. So that sort of introduced a layer of nuance to us that, oh, wow, okay, you can make these really amazing wines, but if you're growing in this one area, it can be very, very different and special. And we started actually to read about the history of Napa Valley, and there's some various books, nonfiction books out there about it. And we thought it was really cool, the tasting of Paris and the Napa Valley vintners versus the French and all that. But when you start reading about Napa Valley wine history, you're reading about California wine history. And most of these books would have a paragraph or a footnote about the early days of California wine. And there was always these mentions of Los Angeles, and being born and raised in LA. Yeah, that kind of stuck with me, and it kept popping back up. And it was upon further investigation that we discovered that the California wine trade and industry started here in LA. And so that was like the second light bulb. As it turned out, the more we started to think about this sort of existence of Los Angeles being the birthplace of California wine, I remembered that my mom had given me a bottle of LA wine that a couple of years previously that I had at the time just dismissed and said, oh, great, thanks, and tossed it in our wine fridge. And so it occurred to me one day, oh, I have that bottle of some weird LA wine that my mom gave us. And I pulled it out of the fridge, and it was a bottle of Moraga. And it turned out the winemaker at Moraga was a family friend of my mom and her husband. So we got out this bottle of Moraga and thought, well, let's try this, and opened it, and it was spectacular. And I was blown away. I couldn't believe it. Being this big fan of Napa Valley Cab and Red, I couldn't believe that there was this wine grown in LA and made in LA that was just as good, if not better, as some of the other wines that I'd been drinking. So actually from there, I got the winemaker, Scott Rich, who makes fantastic Pinot Noir in Sonoma, by the way. His winery is called Talisman. But he was the winemaker. He was flying down to make Moraga's wine and had been there for 25 years or so. And I called him and said, look, I get it that Moraga is a special place in particular. Like this, obviously the vineyard is doing something special. But I asked him in general, what were his thoughts on the potential for Los Angeles wine? Is Moraga like just the only place where this can be true? And he said no. And he was extremely bullish about other projects. He'd done some little projects making Chardonnay for people in Bel Air. He was making some Sangiovese for someone. And he said, look, it's all about what you're growing and where it's grown. And he suggested that if we had any LA wine previously that wasn't good, it was either the wrong grapes grown in the wrong place, or it was not a serious effort. And so from there, that set us off on our journey.
Maybe just to orient people, I'm not on the West Coast. I'm out here in Maryland on the East Coast. And so just like geographically, to get a sense of when you talk about this can be done in a lot of different places, what does that really mean geographically? Can you maybe draw a picture in the mind of listeners for that?
Sure. So when you think of the LA basins, you have the bay and the basin, and that's backed up by mountains as you move further inland. A place like Moraga is actually in the middle of, not in the city as in building, but it's in the city of LA. It's on the coastal side of the mountains. It's near the 405 freeway where the Getty Center is. And it's warm, it's away from the ocean, but it's still going to have that coastal influence. And I think places like that, places like the Malibu coast, which obviously Malibu coast tells you it's near the ocean, but there's a lot of canyons and inland sides and the ocean sides. There's variations. I think places like that are conducive to Bordeaux varieties and other grapes that need a little more of a cooler conditions. When I talk about the Antelope Valley, going from downtown LA, you're talking about 60 to 70 miles, really northeast, and you're going into the high desert at that point. Antelope Valley is where Edwards Air Force Base is. Now, there's not wine growing next to Edwards Air Force Base, but again, as you move further north, you find these areas that have really high elevations where you're super hot in the day, sure, but you're going to cool way off at night. We're talking about some of these vineyards. Billy picked the Swayze vineyard. That was at 3,500 feet. As you go inland, generally speaking, in LA, you're getting hotter, and that can make growing certain cooler climate grapes a challenge. But as you go further east and north, you continue actually to gain in elevation. And the Alonso family vineyard is out there. That's probably 2,800 feet in the mountains, basically. So it's just about, no one's growing Pinot Noir and Chardonnay in Antelope Valley, but there's Pinot Noir down in Palos Verdes, which is a peninsula down on the coast. There's Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Zinfandel being grown on Catalina Island. So you have to pick your spots as to where you're going to source from.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like when we say LA County as a whole, not just the city. So I wanted to ask a couple questions about the history, but I think I want to dive into your wines first now, and then we'll take a step back. What is your lineup? And can you talk a little bit about the critical recognition that you guys have gotten in some of, like, you guys are also in really high-end restaurants. So I just want to give our listeners a frame of reference of the types of wines you're making.
Sure, no problem. I mean, our focus tends to be the classic red varieties. Cabernet Sauvignon is one of the spearhead. Our flagship wine is Cabernet. We do a good amount of Syrah, which does really well down here. We work with Grenache. There's a lot of different varieties planted in LA. Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah, Petit Syrah, Grenache. Those are like our key reds. We do a little Tannat as well. We've done a little Alicante Boucher. We tinker around, but we try to keep our focus is pretty classic. And then when it comes to white and rosé, we do a little bit of that as well. There's not as much white planted down here, but we've done Chardonnay from Ventura, actually, although there is a little Chardonnay in LA. It's hard to come by. We've done a little bit of Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon, but our focus is definitely classically styled. And as far as acceptance, when we first started, no one wants to talk to you. LA wine, what? No, thanks. So it was a challenge in the beginning to break through, and we still find challenges of people. There's like an invisible mental block that people have still towards Los Angeles wine, but it started to break down. And one of the things that we found is the buyers at restaurants with really well-established wine programs, who are also well-funded and have customers and clients who are looking for the really bespoke experiences. That's where we seem to find the most willingness and openness to our wine. Since opening a tasting room, we're not as active in the wholesale, market as we used to be. But at one time or another, we've had our wine at Provident. We've had our wine in 71 Above downtown, Wally's, wine bars like Augustine and Covell, Vintage in Studio City, really places where people care about wine and the sort of one-on-one interaction with a customer who wants that level of knowledge. That's where we have found the most success in the marketplace.
Yeah, because I'm sure there are some just like headwinds when you just think economically. You were talking about the Malibu coast. I'm trying to think. I wouldn't imagine the premium for cab is the same that you would get in maybe a place like Napa Valley. So where is the fruit coming, or how has the fruit been established in those places? Or are people really just paying Malibu real estate and putting vines on them and then being able to make a profit later? Like just talk me through that a little bit.
Yeah, well, the economics are generally not good, which is it's a bit unsettling, but it's also, honestly, if you're drinking a bottle of Los Angeles wine at this point, everyone involved is doing it for one reason, that they really care about this wine and or this region. Like they're all made, whether it's us or any of the other LA vintners, they're made with love, because there's only one commercial vineyard that I'm aware of in LA County where you can just go buy fruit, and it's relatively new. They've only sold fruit for the last 2 years. So all of the other available fruit in LA is privately owned, and it was planted usually by someone who wanted to have this wine as their dream. And either they've stopped making it at this point, or they're still making it, but making less. So it's really stitched together by people who care. There's not any grape business here. It's just people growing wine grapes for the love of wine. And so you have to source in that way.
And with that, I guess with the lower volumes too, some of them, it's hard to get in front of a wider audience in general. How have you guys have gotten some scores? I can't remember the publications, maybe you could share. And then also your tasting room. How are you guys spreading the word, but also making sure you don't overextend yourselves with the wines that you do have?
Sure. No, that's a great question. I mean, we haven't actually submitted any wines for scores in a few years now. We've gotten some good scores from Wine Enthusiast, and we've gotten, way back when we had someone at Parker try a couple wines and taste. I think generally when it comes to scores, we find at this point that most of the reviewers won't even, you just don't even get a response. And I don't want to throw any shade on any of the reviewers, but I think it probably because we're so small and so niche that they need to be focused on broad appeal, and or they're just not down here. But people like Matt Kettman at Wine Enthusiast has been great to all of the LA vendors over the years. You send Matt wine, he'll review the wine and give you feedback. He's come down here before. That's been great. But I'm more than anything now finding that anyone who's interested in our wine for any reason just doesn't care about a score. And I feel like the scores thing has gotten to the point where if you're not getting 98 and 99 and 100 points, I just feel like everyone gets 90 plus now. I think the scores mattered most when there was a lot of bad quality out there. But we did submit for scores more early on, because I think we felt like we needed to establish, hey, these wines are legit. These wines are real. We did a lot of that. And then without a tasting room, we really tried to pound the pavement and get our wines into these places that I mentioned that had really good wine programs so we could reach people. But you are always in one of the biggest, if not the biggest wine consumption markets in the country. It's so competitive out there. Like it could not be it's a really good time to be a wine consumer. There's so many choices. There's so many options. There's so much quality available to you that is a really hard market to be out there in trying to get noticed. So at the end of the day, the tasting room is where it all really makes the most sense for you. That's the outlet now.
Yeah. And especially because can you share a little bit about I know you said cab earlier, but the style of wine, like you're making these very high quality, higher price point reds. So you're competing with some of the upper echelon of the Napa sides and the Sonoma side. So that's also probably something to do with it too. It's not like somebody can just take a flyer without being like properly walked through on like a $70 or $80+ bottle.
Oh, totally. When I think for on-premise and restaurants and bars, everything is by the glass now. Everything's got to be by the glass, and you have to be priced competitively. What's the average glass price in LA is probably $16 to $18 top for a red. There are places that get into the 20s, and then there's people who have Corvin programs and all that. But to be competitive at that price point is really difficult. That's why we did used to do a lot of by the glass stuff. That's really not a moneymaker. That's just about getting the wines out there, which is great. And then when you do stuff with high-end bottles, bottles just don't move like they used to. Restaurants, you might sell a case a year to a high-end restaurant, and that how many of those high-end restaurants are you going to sell one case of wine to a year to have it make sense?
Yeah, but like stylistically, how would you Can you give us like an example of maybe the wine that I tasted last weekend of like how it's oak regimen and like kind of what makes it on par with some of these wines that you're competing against?
Oh yeah, sure. Well, we've got, like I said, I think everything would trace back to our style of wine, traces back to the style of wines that we like to drink. So we first fell in love with the Napa Valley Cabernet, and I know lots of people seem to have moved on from Cabernet, and I get it. There's tons of it. There's all these other exciting grapes, but the classics, our style, like I said, is very classical. So our top wine is usually 100% Cabernet Sauvignon, sometimes a little bit of Cab Franc blended in. It's from a vineyard that we look after in the Malibu coast. It's a tiny 1.5 acre, maybe 2 acre vineyard, super steep hillside. We have a vineyard manager who works with us. We farm it, and we get Cab out of there, and we get Syrah out of there. Our style with both of those wines, but focus mainly on the Cab, we tend to let our fruit hang. We try to pick as late as possible. We want to let that hang time, let those flavors develop. Our wine, also given a hot region, we tend to be 15 plus on the alcohol, riper style. But we usually bring fruit in. We cold soak usually for a few days, get a little more texture, a little extraction there. We do open top, regular bin ferments. We try and keep the fruit in contact with the juice as much as possible, extra punch downs, et cetera, et cetera. And then really what we've leaned into is extended maceration on those wines. We trying to get around 30 to 35 days total on the skins with that Cab at this point, which really it gives you the extra tannin, and it really makes those tannins quality and fine grain. Generally speaking, wines from LA tend to not be super tannic, probably because the temperature cools off at night. It doesn't get cold. So we're actually looking to get more tannin out of the wines if we can. We do a little bit of stem inclusion sometimes on that wine, just a smidge. And then for barrels, we're using new French oak for that wine. We used to use new French and new American in everything we did. And I think over time, our styles refined a bit where we're trying to get more texture and structure out of the fruit itself and have the oak support more. But this Cabernet in particular can totally hang with brand new French oak. But we're also now experimenting with a mixture of styles. So we are using medium plus toasted head Sealand Moreau barrels for the Cab. And then we're also using some light toast new French oak, which can be a little more respectful of the fruit and give you a little extra body and tannin, but not overwhelmed with wood. And then those wines see that big wine, that Cabernet, the Byron Blatty, usually sees 2 years-ish in the barrel. And then we usually age it for at least a year before release. Look up your tech notes on any kind of Napa Valley Cab, big wine notes, like that's kind of the approach. And then those new barrels usually get rolled down into our program. A lot of second fill on some of the other wines, less new oak, but stylistically, Napa Valley Cabernet, wines like from Paso, L'Aventure, Aaron, these are the stylistic, those are the styles that we like to drink. So we model our wines initially after those.
And then some varieties, Tempranillo, Syrah, Grenache. You talked a little bit about nod to the Napa style. But also, I see in your notes, obviously on the Grenache and Syrah nods to Chateau de Pape in ways that you might think about those wines through that lens. Maybe you can talk about that part of the portfolio.
Yeah, of course. The cab is probably the most classic that we do, and everything else steers in those directions. But we're not Napa Valley. We're not Chateau de Pape. We're not Central Coast. So we always have to do things a bit our own way. And that's been part of the journey too, is finding what these vineyards are capable of doing. When we first started, we wanted to ram everything into a particular style. And I guess you learn fairly quickly that just doesn't work. You can make nice wine, but you want to make the best version you can possibly make. So for wines like Grenache, the Grenache that we work with in LA is soft. It's softer, and you really can't, if you nail that with new oak, it just obliterates it. So we tend to blend, we blend Syrah. That's nothing new, right? Syrah blended in Syrah Grenache, those go together. But when we look for a little extra structure, we've gone with some Petit Verdot. We had a wine for a while, Tremor, that was a GSM, but it was Grenache, Syrah, and Merlot because there was no Mourvèdre down here. There is some now, but eventually that wine got a Petit Verdot and still does. So we tweak things. I think the general approach, Brady, for any of our wines is we start just as a baseline. We're looking to make the best Grenache or whatever the variety is from that vineyard that we can possibly make as a standalone wine. And then if blending will improve that wine, then we blend. And it's been actually recently that we've started for the first time release some of these wines that are 100% single varietal wines. And we didn't do it in the past because we didn't think they were good enough alone. And the last couple of years, we've started to release a few that are 100% single varietal. And if I think about it, I think that means we're achieving something that we weren't necessarily achieving early on. And that's just maybe better picking decisions, better cellar decisions, the more figuring out how to get more out of the fruit during fermentation. And it seems to be working. The blending is always going to be like the best wines in the world are blends, classically, apart from, I know, no shade to Pinot or Chardonnay, but that's a North Star. Make the best single variety that you can. And then if we can improve by blending, we improve by blending.
That's awesome. It's interesting because way back in the day in France, they used to bring like Syrah from Hermitage into like beef up Bordeaux and it was too lean. So it's cool you're going the other way to balance it out with Petit Verdot, going to the Rhône style wines.
Oh, totally. We whenever we sit down to do blends, anything that we're working with is on the table. It's about making the best wine. We try not to get locked into, it has to be this way, it has to be that way. It's just got to be the best wine we can possibly make.
Awesome. So I have two questions. I have a habit of asking these, so I'm going to break them up into one. First, I don't know how I've gone this long, but it's been bothering me for years now. How does the name Byron Blatty come along? Because your name's Mark, and I thought your name was Byron for like years.
That's funny. Well, my middle name is Byron. So it's a very modestly named winery. No, literally, Byron is my middle name that I've always disliked. And in fact, I very rarely go by my first name. Usually it's just people call me by my last name. And before we had wine in the barrel, but we didn't have a brand name or anything like that. And I think my wife and I were having dinner and randomly, she just said, Byron Blatty. And I said, what's Byron Blatty? And she said, the winery. It's called Byron Blatty. And we went, oh yeah, Byron Blatty. So that's how it came to be. And it doesn't hurt. There's a little LA in Blatty.
I didn't even think about that. That's cool. Yeah, the alliteration, it goes really well. Nice. And then the other part on the LA wine history, did I read somewhere that you had worked with the Mission San Gabriel to make some wine at some point, or did like a collaboration?
Yeah, no, and that's a really cool thing. That's an ongoing thing. So it was during COVID, in 2020, I guess. 2020. We got contacted. I got a woman named Terry Huerta, who runs the Mission San Gabriel, reached out on like our LA Vintners info message thing from the website and said, hey, I've got these old vines planted here and I need some help propagating them because we're remodeling the mission and can someone there help me? And so I remembered being down at the mission as a kid and I thought, it's like really old grapevines there. And I started looking around online and went, oh yeah, there are these old vines here. And so I called Pat Kelly from Cavaletti and Jasper and Amy from Angelino and said, hey, there are these old vines at St. Gabriel Mission. And
they're like 200 years old. They're like very old vines.
1770s. Yeah.
Yeah.
and I said, they need some help with something. And if we're the LA Vintners, like no one else should be like, this should be us. This has to be us. Let's go. And everybody agreed. So we went and met her, and at the time the mission was closed, everything. And she walked us into the courtyard where the Ramona vine is the oldest vine there. It planted supposedly in 1774. Literally full stop. It's the oldest grapevine in California. Not one of the oldest. And then some of these other vines on property, I think, are a little later in the 1700s, maybe even 1800s. And then some of them, I don't know this to be true, so I can't be quoted on this, but some of the other vines on the property, I think, are actually the same vine that like the tendrils found the ground and then just planted new roots. Like it's really insane. If you can get over there, you got to check it out. But so she was doing, they were doing a renovation and they needed cuttings because they wanted to plant more vines in the property, but they wanted it to be from their vines. So Pat Kelly's a vineyard manager and he took that on. But when we were all down there, it was, I want to say it was September or something of 2020. And there was fruit. I knew the vines were there, but I didn't know that they were still grapes. And there was tons and tons and tons of fruit hanging in the pergola. So we just said to Terry, hey, we'll help you with the vines, but what about this fruit? And she said, oh, just come and get it. Yeah. Otherwise the groundkeepers are going to cut it down because it just makes a mess. So we started digging into the whole thing and we realized that this vine is it's a hybrid because I guess it had been tested in the past. They did like samples of it had been sent to UC Davis. And it's a hybrid. It's a cross between Mission and Vitis Gurdiana, which is a native grape to Southern California. It, as far as I'm aware, it only exists at the San Gabriel Mission and or anywhere where cuttings from that vine were taken and planted. And there are some vines from the early 1800s at Olvera Street in downtown LA that some other people have made wine from in the past. And those are cuttings from the Mission. So what we did anyways, the long story short, in 2020, we made Angelica, which is the wine that the missionaries would have made in those days, which is a fortified wine. And it's actually not even a fortified wine, it's fortified juice. So we pick it, it goes in the press, and then the juice, the unfermented juice gets fortified with spirits. And so we did it in 20, 21, 22, 23. We picked 2-3 weeks ago, and we've got a little Solera going. Barely makes a barrel a year, not even a barrel, maybe a half a barrel. And we released the first one in we released the 2020 last year. And then this December, really in maybe 2-3 weeks, we're going to release the next vintage. And it's split Cavaletti, Angelino, us, and then a little portion of it goes to the Mission as well. So I think our allotment this year will be 3 cases of half bottles.
Wow, it's amazing. And are those wines, the wines that we just discussed, are you pouring all of those at your new tasting room in Highland Park?
Yeah. not the Angelica. It's
Right,
just
yeah.
too scarce. But yeah, we've got maybe 13 or 14 different wines that we pour
Nice.
on a regular basis at the tasting room and down there on York. And we try to rotate. We keep things. We've got a bunch of library wines that we stashed away. So we've got some of our 16s. We've got some 17s, not much 18 left, but we keep a constant rotation of some of our older stuff and current releases down at the tasting room. Yeah.
And so when you think about the next couple of years in terms of what growth looks like and how people can really tap into what you're doing, is that going to be mainly focused on trying to grow production in certain ways? Are you trying to stay at that point? Or is it about, enhancing the guest experience at the tasting room from a business perspective, monetizing that a little bit more? What are the sort of, 2 to 5
Yeah,
years?
no, that's it. I think our goals in the short term are really just establishing the tasting room and making sure that people understand there's a place to go to try these wines. We keep the flights rotating. We have an event program. In fact, we just did Wednesday night, we did a comparative tasting where we ran our Chardonnay up next side by side with the Chablis. We did our Tempranillo side by side with a Rioja Reserva. And then we did our 21 cab with a not our big wine, but our second cab. We did that alongside a Napa Valley wine, not as a competition, but just as a side by side comparison. So we try to make the tasting room a place where people can try the wines, but it's also a bit of educational stuff, just making it a place for wine. We do guest winemakers. We have friends that make wine, don't have tasting rooms. We have them come and pour. So I think the goals for the short term are just the tasting room only opened 4 or 5 months ago. We went from 2 days a week to 4. We're now rolling out events. It's to establish that, get back to growing our wine club. We started in 14, but again, we didn't really hit the market until 18. And then 2 years later, COVID shut everything down. And then it took 2 years to get the tasting room open. It's like we're 10 years old and we're brand new. So we're doing that. We have our wine club. We're trying to grow that. And then right now, production, we've tried to keep it super focused and narrow on trying to make sure that we're really focused on the higher end of our program in general right now. And then as we get through some of our existing inventory, our club expands, we'll look to keep growing and expanding production over years, but we're going to do it paced as we go and as needed to meet the demands of our customer base.
Yeah, that's super cool. I think it's exciting. Like I worked for the re-release for a little while and that had a little bit of wine, but I think it's really fun how wine and the culture is coming back to the east side of LA. And I think your tasting room is going to help just educate people on what it used to be like more in like around Highland Park. And if you went up to Pasadena, it was like all vines back in the day. And I still get off for the gym every day where the El Aliso winery used to be in their vineyard. And I'm so sad it's a commercial park. I think the ultimate goal of the Vintner Society should be to get rid of that, whatever is there now, and eventually plant vines, although it would probably be tainted by the highway at this point. But
that's the sad thing is that about LA and LA wine is like the history of LA wine is basically been erased.
Paved over.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's also what makes the wines that are coming out of LA special, I think, when whether it's us or Angelino, Cavaletti, Herman York, like any of these guys. There's Aja down in Malibu Coast. Like I said, anyone who's growing or making wine in LA right now has to care a ton about it, or it's just impossible,
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, I think that's actually a perfect place for us to wrap up here. So we really appreciate your time and thanks so much for joining today.
Well, thanks for having me.
All right. That was our interview with Mark Blatty from Byron Blatty Wines. I hope everybody goes and checks out their portfolio and definitely visit the tasting room if you're out here in LA. And from that, that is our episode for this week. It was brought to you by the Vint Marketplace. We do, as Brady mentioned, have one of the largest selections of wines, over 18,000, both domestically available as well as directly imported from Europe. I don't know if everybody knows that a lot of our wines are direct imports, which means the provenance is excellent. and the quality is top notch. For now, that is our episode for this week, and we'll be back with another episode next week. Cheers.